Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about various options for buying affordable, complicated wristwatches. And the reason why I'd like to talk about this today is because a great deal of brands such as Seiko and Oris have started to release models with complications using fairly rugged and basic movements that can be serviced quite simply, but that offer a great deal of complications on the dial which allow those, like myself for instance, who don't have all the money in the world, but want a certain piece of horology that would normally be out of reach. So as a result, I'd like to talk about 5 of my favourites, really, from the relatively budget price point for these complications, from brands such as Seiko, as I've said, Oris, Christopher Ward, and even Nomos. Now, the first watch I'd like to talk about is the new Seiko Cocktail Time, and this is the Power Reserve version released at Basel World this year. And this watch is, I think, a very interesting piece because for €540, which will be the price of this watch, one can get a watch with a really wonderful decoration of the dial, for instance, with also the added complication of a power reserve. And of course it does have an in-house caliber 4R 5729 dual movement from Seiko themselves. Now, beginning with the case is 40.5mm across and is 14.5mm thick. And the thickness I'll talk about in just a moment, but the finishing of the case is fully polished, as this is very much a dress watch, despite the fact that a lot of the Presage models are semi-sports watches. This one is very much a dedicated dress watch. And I personally believe the case to be very interesting because it has very simple lines, as of this year's model, but I think it's very nicely implemented. And that thickness is as a result of that very heavily domed box crystal on the top, which is Hardlex, which is Seiko own proprietary crystal. But despite the fact that it's not as scratch resistant as sapphire, I find it to be more shock resistant than mineral. So you get quite a nice balance between both, which I personally appreciate. I also do appreciate that they make their own crystals, so as a result there's a great deal of versatility with regards to making the watch exactly the way they wanted it to be. But that really is why the watch is so thick at 14.5mm. But rest assured that it will slip under a cuff due to the heavily domed nature and very smooth nature of that stepped bezel and crystal. Now, the crown of the watch is another interesting touch, which I think does show Seiko's great attention to detail at this price point. And it has a slope to it, which means that it appears to be an onion crown in terms of profile, but actually is quite simple and minimalistic, but is still easy to grip as a result of that knurling and edging. Also, it is signed, which is a rare thing for Seiko's around this price point, which again adds value to the watch. Now, the watch's real pièce de résistance is that dial, which I personally feel is really beautiful for this price point. In terms of the general finishing of the dial, we have a sunburst effect in various colours depending on the model you go for, all defined by the last digit of the serial number, which I'll have up with a hyphen through the last digit, so you can select or add in the digit that you would want. But the dials of these watches are sunburst effect, but also have these ridges going around the dial, which do add depth to it, as is already provided by those applied indices, which are beautifully polished. Of course, the dial is also host to other complications. Notably, at 6 o'clock we have a small pointer date, which has its own recessed subdial away from the rest of the dial, again adding quality to this, with its own much finer pattern of sunburst finishing, which really does show Seiko's care when it comes to giving the impression of great quality that they put into their watches. Of course, one has the very attractive ring around the edge of this pointer date as well, which again is very legible, despite the fact that it is also very elegant, and in my opinion more elegant than having a date window on a conventional dress watch. The most interesting additional feature on this watch and complication is that power reserve, which I personally love because it runs around the edge of the dial and isn't terribly obtrusive, whereas often power reserves can be something which offsets the balance of a dial because they have to be a separate window or particular feature on the dial, whereas here we have a very simple way of approaching this problem, which demonstrates the 41-hour power reserve that this watch has from the 12 o'clock position through to about 10 past 4. This care is also shown in the hands, which have a beautiful finishing with blues in my particular favourite version, and also very heavily polished hands, which are these Dauphine-style hands, which though unloomed will be very legible due to the reflections they give off. Now, the next watch I'd like to talk about is also another Seiko Presage, and this was a watch that was released in 2016 as a limited edition version, but is now available as an unlimited model, which I think really does add value to this watch. And this version is effectively the big brother to the Seiko Cocktail Time with the Power Reserve. And this features exactly the same features on the face of it, but in terms of the features the movement offers and also the general case finishing this really does step up a certain level to provide you with an altogether higher quality timepiece. Now, starting with the case, the dimensions of the watch are 40.5mm by 12.8mm, so the thickness of this watch is substantially cut, courtesy of the movement, the 6R27, which is one of Seiko's higher-end automatic movements, and really does outdo the lower-end models from Seiko, in that this runs at 4Hz rather than the 3Hz usually seen on Seiko movements, which gives a much smoother sweep to the second hand. And also this has a 45-hour power reserve to the 41 of their other versions, which does, I feel, add value to the watch, as far as practicality and usability does. And despite the fact this is only an extra 4 hours to the power reserve, it really does help with regards to the day-night cycle, with regards to not having to wind your watch up and simply put it on the wrist in the morning. Now, the finishing of the case is rather complex. One has a brushed finish on the top of the lugs, but even there you have a polished edge on the inside to further emphasise the difference between these two aspects of the watch. It has a polished bezel, which is again very nicely faceted on its edges to smoothly run into that crystal over the top of the watch. The sides of the watch are also polished to further add a lustrous air to this watch, as a luxury Japanese timepiece. Now, the dial of the watch is probably the most famous aspect of this timepiece, and it features these beautifully blued hands, which are a very classic format, and then the second hand with the crescent moon on the end of it, which I think adds a very elegant and classic air to this watch, which usually isn't seen around this price point. Similarly, one can see the power reserve indicator on the left-hand side of the dial, and a pointer date at 6 o'clock. However, it's the dial itself that's gained such popularity, because enamel dials like this are very difficult to make, and in fact this is why I have such respect for brands such as Gino and Zin recently, who've started to produce their own enamel dials, which really are very difficult to make, and certainly difficult at this price point. But the Seiko version is a very soft enamel in terms of its aesthetics, because one has these ridges going down into the dial, which I think add a great deal of fluid motion to that dial, when actually a flat dial, in white especially with Roman numerals, can look a little bit too sedate, whereas here they've really made an effort to make a watch with a dial that is very attractive by making the substrate of the dial curve and have edges, which allows the surface enamel to run into these gullies and set, which of course gives these wonderful undulations of the surface of the dial, which I personally think are very, very elegant. And of course the wonder of enamel is that it gives off a wonderful sheen in the light, which you simply can't get from paint. Now, the next watch is a Christopher Ward, and Christopher Ward are a brand which has come on in leaps and bounds over the last few years, producing more and more interesting models, from everything from their Pilots line to their new in-house line, and also via the Trident dive range, which has been extremely popular as well. The model I'd like to talk about is the C9 Moonphase. And this is a watch which is very interesting because it's able to provide a moonphase to the buyer by running it off the date function, or rather the day of the week function, of an ETA 2836-2. And as you can see, that's why it runs around the centre of the dial, which I personally think is a fantastic idea, because it means that one can produce a watch at a relatively affordable price, despite the fact that it has to be quite heavily modified, of £1,395. With this moonphase, which is often a feature only seen on much higher end watches, and even then they're often seen in much smaller windows, whereas here you get a really fantastic view of the moon. Now, the watch is 40mm in diameter, making it a very wearable size for a dress watch, and has a fully polished case with very attractive bevels and features around the case, and with a very nicely domed case back, which makes it again very comfortable on the wrist. Having had a look at this watch in person, I must say it certainly is a very comfortable piece on the wrist as far as dress watches go. But also the dial, I feel, is really the most important part of this watch, as has been really with the last two watches in this video. And that's because it features a wonderful sunburst effect around the dial, and this dial is available in both blue and white. The blue version with a silver and blue finishing, while the white version has a gold and white. And my personal favourite is the blue, because I feel it has a far more mysterious air to it and sets it apart from other moonphases on the market. Of course, as well as this sunburst effect around the rim of the dial, which very elegantly displays the date at the 6 o'clock position, giving a very symmetrical look to the watch, the dial also has a wonderful level of guilloche finishing around that underside of that central section of the dial where the moonphase emerges. And the moonphase itself is a beautiful piece as well, because you have this nickel pockmarked moon, which goes around the inside of the dial once a month, obviously. But it really is a wonderful piece, because often one sees a simple flat moon, which is attractive, but I don't feel as appealing as this, and doesn't give the wonder to this nearest celestial body that we have in our night sky. Doesn't give it as much emphasis as this watch does. The movement in this watch is also rather interesting too. Now, though it's an ETA 2836 and the moon phases run off the day wheel, it has been modified quite heavily to have a smooth movement of the moon phase rather than having the once a day movement of a date. So that's rather an interesting feature. But also this watch has a moon phase that's accurate for 128 years and shouldn't need adjustment for that long, which I must say is quite remarkable. Especially at this price point, that they're able to engineer such a feature on a watch like this, and especially with the aesthetic details this watch has. Now, the only aspect that I would discuss as being perhaps a drawback to this watch is that despite the fact that the watch has quite a nicely decorated rotor on the caseback with Christopher Ward and various other pieces of decoration on it, the rest of the movement is completely undecorated, which again does represent this price point and the way Christopher would have spent their money on the front of the watch and the moon phase rather than on the decoration of the movement. So that's one drawback that's perhaps going to be a problem for some, but I personally would overlook that due to the mechanical adjustments made by Christopher Ward specifically to run this timepiece. Now, the next watch on this list is the very watch which inspired me to produce this video in the first place, and this is the new Oris Artelier Complication for 2017. And this is rather an interesting watch because it continues in the lines of various other Orises with these three sub-dials and the moonphase, and these have been seen in their pilot line as well as their dress line in the Artelier line of watches. But I do feel that here we see a really attractive piece with a slightly revised movement now, which doesn't require a push or adjustment for all the functions apart from the second time zone. But indeed this watch does now have a moonphase at 12 o'clock, and then at 3 o'clock the day of the week, in a pointer format, as is the date at 9 o'clock, and then the second time zone placed at 6 o'clock, very elegantly in its own sub-dial with a different hand to further emphasise the timekeeping aspect. Now, the dial of this watch features a very extensive use of viewership to give it a really wonderful and simple finish, which I think contrasts the complication of having those three sub-dials, as well as the moonphase on the dial. Now, of course, it does come in two variants, with different emphasis on blue and gold in either one. My personal favourite is the blue, just because I tend to prefer that type of colour palette, but in truth it really is a question and a matter of opinion. Now, the hands on the centre of the dial are loomed, and are a fairly interesting format of the normal Dauphine style, but certainly do match the style of the watch as a very classic yet modern take on the complicated dress watch. Now, in terms of the sub-dials, one has a very elegant sunburst effect, which is much finer than the guilloche pattern on the rest of the dial. So I think one does have a nice variation and quite a complete set, really, as far as the dial is concerned, without making it overbearing with this number of sub-dials on it. And of course, one has a very limited amount of writing on this dial, with simply Oris and Swiss made there, which I think does serve to reduce the complication of this dial and make it altogether easier on the eyes. Similarly, the moonphase at 12 o'clock is a very simple design, a very traditional design based on the architecture of the Sleater SW200, which is of course an ETA 2824 sort of clone or remake. So they have done a great deal of adjustment to the surface of the movement to add all of this complication to it. Now, in terms of the case of the watch, one has a 40mm diameter, making it very comfortable on the wrist and a similar wear to the Seikos, but it does have a much flatter profile, and a much simpler design in that respect, though of course the case is available with either a rather attractive alligator leather strap or a 7-link bracelet which is brushed and polished, which I think matches the line of the lugs very well, though I personally would go for the leather strap because I feel it's more of a traditional look with a dress watch of this type. Now, in terms of price, this watch comes in at $2,250 on the leather strap or $2,450 on the bracelet. So that equates to about £1,750 to £1,900. So similar to the base range of Tudor. But I think for this sort of price, one really is getting a lot from Oris, with the very beautifully polished case, as well as that excellent dial and the great number of features added to this watch, such as the second time zone, the pointer day and date, and of course that Moonphase, which is a greatly attractive feature for many buyers. Now the final watch I'd like to talk about today is the Nomos Tangente Date Power Reserve, and this is a model which I find very interesting, because it takes both the most traditional and most classic of Nomos designs, with those wonderful lugs which are proprietary really to this watch and haven't been seen elsewhere, with this very Bauhaus design, but also presents it with a playful aspect with that offset power reserve, which is not central to the dial or anything of that nature, but floats in the middle of the dial in a seemingly uncalculated position, but I feel actually presents a rather attractive way of showing the power reserve of a watch. So on the face of things, this watch does seem remarkably simple and basic, but in truth, this couldn't really be further from the truth of this watch. And I'll talk about the dimensions of the watch first. So it's a 35mm watch, which does seem rather small, but it has quite a long lug-to-lug distance, and the lugs do arc down, which makes it much more comfortable for those with larger wrists too. And of course, it's only 6.6mm thick, making it extremely slim on the wrist, and really a perfect dress watch for those who want a watch of this nature. Now, it has an in-house caliber DUW 4401, which is a really beautifully decorated movement from Nomos, which is manually wound, and in this case features a small seconds, the date, and also a power reserve. However, I do feel that it's the fact that Nomos are able to produce what they call their swing system, which is their own proprietary escapement. And because very few brands are able to make their own escapement, despite the fact that many brands make their own movements, they have escapements made by other brands for them. Whereas in this case, they are, as a small brand, able to make their own escapement, which really does show how the brand has progressed and become a very important player in the international watch market. Now, in terms of the dial finishing of this watch, we have a very simple flat white finish and base, upon which the various complications and touches are built. So we have this wonderful flat white base with these Bauhaus numerals going around the edge, which match the date numerals very well. And of course, the date is shown within that beveled-edged window at 6 o'clock, giving symmetry to a watch that fundamentally doesn't have symmetry due to the fact that Nomos is offset, as well as the fact that the power reserve is offset as it's placed straight on top of the spring barrel in the movement when I show you a picture of that. So one has a rather interesting layout, which I personally think is rather beautiful, along with those blued hands, which are thermally blued rather than being chemically blued or painted blue, which I think does add a great deal of value to the watch. And also one does have the very interesting presentation of that power reserve, which has this red strip which changes size depending on the amount of energy remaining within the spring, which are all features which are typical of this brand, and they're very unique attention to detail. Of course, from the view of the back of the watch, the movement has a great deal of decoration from Geneva stripes, though of course this is a German watch, through to the perlage on various surfaces, and we really do have a beautifully finished movement as a whole with blued screws as well, which I think does add to the value of this watch as a slightly different option for around this price point of £2,580. Anyway, I'll finish the video here with this rather wonderful view of the front of that Nomos 4401 movement, with both the power reserve and the date wheel visible. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to see more content here in future. Also, do please leave your comments down below as to what you thought of my choices and any choices that you would have put in instead. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, over and out.